Hello friends, in this series of the English essay, we will be today presenting another lecture, and that is by Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has worked a lot on literary theory, on Indian literature and many other aspects, feminism for instance. Today the subject of the lecture is Charles Lamb as an essayist. And I particularly requested her to give her thought to this author, and tell us about how he shaped himself not merely as a biographer or as a teller of tales, but also an essayist. Obviously, Charles Lamb is a poet at heart, and he can then put all that effort into his essays also. Very sentimental, very knowledgeable, very emotional. And of course, a committed writer in the 18th century, and he lived quite long. Luckily, he lasted, people like John Keats and others. So he died 4 years later than John Keats. So he was that way quite senior as a person, as a member of the romantic group that was formed of its own spontaneously in English literature. So I'll request Professor Payal Nagpal to tell us a few things about him. And of course, as an essayist, that's the main topic. So over to you.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. And as you rightly said that, Charles Lamb is a poet. He's also somebody, who's a teller of tales. But today we will be looking at Charles Lamb, the essayist, and how his essays, specifically the essays of Elia, are so very significant, so very important, and how with writers like Charles Lamb and Hazlitt, the essay itself undergoes a change. So before we actually discuss that, to just look at a few aspects about Lamb's life. So he was born in 1775 and as Professor Prakash pointed out, lived up to 1834. He was born in London. And in fact, in a very early essay published in the London Magazine, somewhere in 1802, he writes that the name of the author was given as the Londoner. So he studied, initially, of course, a kind of homeschooling was there, and then he went on to the boarding Christ Hospital, where he was with Coleridge. So he was a contemporary, of course, of the Lake poets, and was especially close to Coleridge, and is known, of course, for the very vibrant essays of Elia and the last essays of Elia. But there was also a lot of trauma because of the condition of his sister Mary. And in 1796, in a fit of insanity, she murdered their mother. So, Charles Lamb never abandoned his sister, and she's an integral part of his writing, of the essays as well. So the essays, of course, were published under the pseudonym of Elia, and the initial comment that was made, that is that with Charles Lamb, and as we enter into the 19th century, the very fabric of the essay itself changes. The way in which the essays were written, structurally they would appear similar, let's say, to the 18th century essay, but actually they were very different. And it's important to keep in mind how the individual is at the center of everything. So here's a portrait of Charles Lamb by Henry Hopner Mayer, and this is by William Hazlitt. So we are looking at pretty much the first and the second decade of the 19th century when we look at Charles Lamb's writing, and what we notice in the 19th century is that there is a very personal tone to the essays. So where the 18th century essay figures, it appears almost as if it is a document of what was happening in the society. So it becomes a kind of social, historical document of the times. Something like the essays of Elia has both aspects. It's not as if the aspect about society is abandoned at all, but there's the individual comes to the center of things. So there is, in that sense, a very personalized tone to the essays. At the same time, we are well aware that if the 18th century was the period of rationality, then in the 19th century, the individual, of course, is important. At the same time, what is also very important is a kind of, a democratic ideal that emerges. So this, how is the question here to be, that one needs to ask is, how do these ideals actually appear in the essay itself? So it's also interesting that Robert Sadeh was critical of these essays. But well, Lamb excels in these personal essays, but they are absolutely rooted in society. So even when Lamb brings himself to the center of things as the individual, and he doesn't in fact ever bring himself as Charles Lamb to the center of things, even when he is writing, for instance, about his experience of Christ Hospital, he takes on the persona of Coleridge and reverses it. So that aspect is very, very interesting. But despite this very personalized tone, the essays are rooted in society. So critics have, of course, considered there to be a kind of merging of the German and the English tradition of the essay. But the important question here is, what does the essay really mean to these writers? How do they reconcile it with the democratic ideals of their age? And this is why the essay, in terms of a kind of category, becomes very important, and it's worthwhile to note how it changes in the 19th century, where we have said that he was, of course, close to Coleridge, but was a contemporary of the Lake poets. So that kind of fervor that was there, how does that get translated, in a sense, into the writing of the essay? Here again, I'd request Professor Prakash to share his views on some of the questions that have been posed.
So initially, I would agree with Professor Payal Nagpal's references to the whole company, the group of the Romantics, and that in fact is a significant factor of Elia's or Charles Lamb's tone. And she is referred to Hazlitt, she is referred to Sadeh, she is referred to Coleridge, and this kind of a sense of company that Charles Lamb enjoys and presents in his essays, that is important. Actually he is not writing himself as if somebody else is writing for him. And this persona question is a very important question in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, because most of the poets are romantics and they talk in their own tone. But here we have a romantic who is very in close companionship with other romantics, but he always assumes another personality. And in fact, here he has two personalities, his own and Elia's. And I don't know whether he is able to maintain the distance or not between the first and the second, or the second and the third. But then this itself becomes dramatic because he is not talking in his own tone. So this subjectivity, this individuality that we refer to, is definitely a factor to reckon with, and this should be kept in mind. Essays are dramatic. I mean, they are emotional, they are sentimental, and but that sentiment belongs to whom? This is the question that she is indirectly posing, and I am sure that she will address these questions regarding the form of the essay. The essay is not merely an expression of a romantic mind, of a romantic sensibility, but the essays themselves present different viewpoints, and those points might agree with one another, join with one another, or clash with one another. So I am just raising letting you know about the form of the essay as a center of my viewpoint in this lecture. So kindly talk about this or something else.
Actually, when we talk about the use of the pseudonym, that's Elia, right? Lamb writes as Elia. And so, what it does in a sense is it creates a distance between the writer who's writing his own views, but these views are voiced through Elia. So there is already a distance when we talk about the constitution of subjectivity in the Romantic period. So unlike, as Professor Prakash rightly pointed out, unlike the Romantics who are foregrounding that I, their personal voice, here is a writer who is writing, that's one level, but writing as Elia, but writing about his own experience. So it's very layered, but what these layers do is they create that sense of objectivity. They prevent, in a sense, any kind of emotional submission to what is being written. So I think, in a sense, that probably gave Lamb greater grip over what he was to write. And so this is carried further actually in the essay titled Christ's Hospital 530 Years Ago, where so there's Lamb writing as Elia, but Elia is writing not about Lamb now, but is writing as Coleridge. So he's reversed it. So the experience of Lamb, who was very privileged, and his experience was very different in Christ's Hospital from that of Coleridge. And Coleridge was very, very lonely. So so he calls himself, and here it's difficult also, but it's important to make out this difference, and also the ability of Lamb to take on different personas. So not just the persona of Elia, but also that of Coleridge in this sense. So further objectivity is of course created, but the essay here is also a document, it's a means through which Lamb is engaging with what different experiences were meant to be, because the experience that he writes as Elia in the first person is not his own, but is that of Coleridge. He takes on Coleridge's persona here. So to quote from this essay, I was a poor, friendless boy. My parents and those who should care for me were far away. So actually Coleridge's family was far away. Those few acquaintances of theirs, which they could reckon upon being kind to me in the great city, after a little forced notice, which they had the grace to take of me on my first arrival in town, soon grew tired of my holiday visits. They seemed to them to recur too often, though I thought them few enough, and one after another they all failed me, and I felt myself alone among 600 playmates. So it's clear that this acceptance of the fact of course, Lamb's privileged position and Coleridge's context, which is very different, is something very brave, and at the same time the ability to take on something which does not, in a sense, which is not his personal experience, but to foreground that as against his own in the essay is the second very important thing. The third aspect, particularly about this particular essay, is the fact that he is able to bring out the difference between the experience of two students. And again, that is interesting, the fact that it's not as if everybody in Christ's Hospital had the same experience. The fact that students, and here the individual becomes important, that each one of them had their own specific experience that they could kind of talk about. So a little later, of course, he talks about how there were these bedlam cells where a boy was being punished, and how these bedlam cells where a boy could just lie at his length upon straw and a blanket, and of course with a peep of light let in from a prison orifice at top, barely enough to read by. But he compares this with his own, and he says, we lived a life as careless as birds. So this idea of freedom, as is he's capturing it from the experience of a young student who's in a boarding house. Christ's Hospital is a boarding school. So we lived a life as careless as birds. So to compare these two, to compare a kind of imprisonment, a kind of punishment with the kind of freedom, also helps him appreciate the freedom that they had. So this, in a sense, is very, very important, and the essay, of course, in a very personal tone, charts the experience of having stayed in that particular boarding house. Now, another aspect of Lamb's essays is his tone, the wit, humor, something that carries on forward actually from the 18th century. So the wit, the humor, use of irony is very, very important in Lamb, as it is to the 18th century writers. So to just take an example here, Two Races of Men is one of the essays written by Elia. So, and it goes like this: the human species, according to the best theory I can form of it, is composed of two distinct races. So, he's divided humankind into two parts. The interesting part is that these two parts are not what one would expect: the men who borrow and the men who lend. So, one would obviously think that it is the men who lend would be considered to be the the privileged ones and so on. So, he says to these two original diversities may be reduced all those impertinent classifications of Gothic, Celtic and so on, tribes, white men, black men, red men and so on and so forth. Then he says that all these dwellers on the earth, and they flock hither and naturally fall in with one or the other of these primary distinctions, which is that of borrowing and lending. The infinite superiority of the former, that is the borrower, he considers the borrower to be far superior to the lender. So he says the infinite superiority of the former, which I choose to designate as the great race, is discernible in their figure, port and a certain instinctive sovereignty. The latter are born degraded. He shall serve his brethren. So we look at the use of humor, use of wit and irony. So how, of course, and if one may say so, to extend this idea further, there is deep consciousness of the way in which money is gradually regulating society. So there is a sense, I think, that this division of between borrowers and lenders, and he says the borrowers are fine because the lenders are, they are the degraded ones, and their job is to serve their brethren. So this particular, and he says there is something in the air of one of this caste, lean, suspicious, contrasting with the open, trusting, generous manner of the other. Observe who have been the greatest borrowers of all ages, and it's interesting, he calls Falstaff one of them, and Sir Richard Steele is another one. So he say, and of course, Alcibiades and Brinsley. So he says that, and Falstaff is particularly very interesting here. So he says that there is such a likeness in all these people. So this, in a sense, also reverses the expectation that the reader had of this kind of division in society. So once again, I would request Professor Prakash to share his views on, the use of wit and humor and this kind of irony by Lamb.
Yes, at one level, Professor Nagpal, it's humor and wit, but I was also looking through these things, regarding his basic sympathies, which are for the borrower,
Yes.
because this borrower is a helpless person, and he is a poor person, and he has to look after a family, he has to go into all the aspects of holding the domestic peace, and there is the lender whose eye is always in the pocket of the borrower. So later on, very soon, within 20-30 years, people will start talking about socialism, and there will be Shelley, and there will be Byron, and there will be even Wordsworth, the earlier Wordsworth. So there is you can see that social reality, the social divisions, the poor and the rich, they are already in the air of the 18th century, and this is entirely different from the 18th century that has already passed. So you have in 1770s and before, you have people who always look up to the upper classes, the lenders, and immediately the world changes in England, and in the second half, or particularly the second quarter of the century, you have people who will look at these poor downtrodden people with sympathy, and if they you are asking about humor and wit in him, so this wit is doubly sharp, in the sense that humor is and wit also is combining itself with the poor people, the downtrodden.
Yes.
And when you go into their innocence, their spontaneity of life, their peace that they are creating, and from that angle you are criticizing society, then you are of course using wit in order to further drive home the point that after all the division has to be filled, and that this division, who will fill it, when will it happen, all that is a matter of conjecture. But so far as Lamb is concerned, his sympathies are absolutely clear. See?
Absolutely. In fact, he says, when he says that, he shall serve his brethren, the whole idea is, like you said, that till this gap is filled, it is the job. It's almost as if the upper class, in a sense, is carrying that burden which they need to do away with. So he says, when I think of this man, his fiery glow of heart, his swell of feeling, how magnificent, how ideal he was. And when I compare him with the companions with whom I have associated since. Now this I is very important here, because there's a distance between Lamb, who's writing, but he's writing in the persona, he's taken on the persona of Elia. So he says, with him, the companions with whom I have associated since, I grudge the saving of a few idle ducats and think I am fallen into the society of lenders and little men. So the largeness, in a sense of feeling, is associated with the poor people, with the borrowers, and it is, the people who are the lenders are considered to practically be, when he says fallen into the society of lenders, so it is a downfall in a sense, and it is in terms of human worth, the lenders are far lower as compared to the poor people who are the borrowers. And but what is interesting is that the wit and humor is so sharp that it prevents any kind of shallow sentimentalism here. So what it does, in fact, is it allows the reader to engage objectively with these ideas. It draws attention to some very important aspects of, and this tone actually, in the most serious of things, continues through all his essays, and the range is very, very diverse. So there are personalized experiences from Christ Hospital, and then there is an essay like this, The Two Races of Men, and of course the very famous Old China and the essay on Hertfordshire, which we will be discussing. But be it something that is personal, or be it something that is about the landscape, Lamb has the ability to ensure that the reader is not kind of wallowing in any kind of sentiment, but is able to objectively engage with what they are reading. And I think this, in a sense, also kind of takes into consideration, if we compare it with the tone of the Romantics, then that tone is also quite varied. For instance, a Wordsworth writes in a certain style, but the style of, say, Shelley is very different, or Byron is very different. But their sympathies very clearly lie with people who are underprivileged, with, in this context, the borrowers. So, to one like Elia, he says, whose treasures are in leather covers and than closed in iron coffers, he says there is a class of alienators that are more formidable than that. And he says that, he talks about the borrowers of books and everything. And again, so he carries this whole process of borrowing to a different level altogether. So we see that in these two essays, the topics that are taken up are very different. One emerging from a very personalized understanding, and the other is, in a sense, a kind of point of view. So, and the point of view belongs to Elia, through Elia to Lamb. So this kind of distancing of Lamb from the essay itself by juxtaposing Elia becomes very important, and I think that is what helps Lamb create this kind of an essay which allows for engagement, posing of questions, and a certain kind of thinking through.
In this part of the lecture, Professor Payal Nagpal has laid the background for considering his specific essays. She has confined herself basically to the attitude, what she calls the point of view from where things are looked at in society in the 18th century, and this makes it very social, very objective, and very driven by what can be called the class divisions. And at the core of the 18th century now is a kind of rationality that existed earlier, and the sentiment that was growing in the latter part of the 18th century. So we look up all those things there in the essays and the world that the essays represented very soon in the next lecture. Thank you.